You're listening to the CD Baby DIY Musician Podcast. Hey there, and welcome to episode number 34 of the CD Baby DIY Musician Podcast. My name is Kevin. I'll be your host for the show, and on this episode, we're going to be talking to Carl Saff. Carl is a mastering engineer in the Chicago area, and we've mentioned mastering a couple times in various episodes of the podcast. But since mastering in many situations for the indie artist is an afterthought or a step that is often skipped, we thought it would be good to dedicate an entire show to the topic of mastering to help shed some light on why it's so important in the recording process and why you definitely don't want to skip that step in making your record. Well, let's get to my interview with Carl.
A record is really a record. It's an archive of a moment in your musical history.
The most valuable thing that you have as a musician and artist is what makes you different.
A really good engineer knows how to handle digital and not make it sound like digital.
Politely asked, would you consider featuring this video?
One of the challenges that everybody has is what I call the reality of the glut.
A journey and a process, and it's not a
And I never actually thought that I would do this for a living.
Yeah, really, what is art? It's magic. It's this thing that we don't understand.
Well, joining me now is Carl Saff, a mastering engineer in the Chicago area. Carl, how are you doing?
Pretty good.
Well, why don't you start out by giving us a little of your background as a mastering engineer, and then we can kind of jump into some of the historical perspectives on mastering and help us make sense of the whole mastering issue.
Sure, no problem. Well, I've been tracking and mixing records for about 10, 12 years. I started making records in about 1994 with just a small collection of very primitive digital gear that I was able to cobble together and drag around to various spaces in various states, including Indiana and Illinois eventually when I moved to Chicago. And was making mostly demos for bands that I knew personally. And some of those ended up being released, actually. And that was when people started coming to me asking me to do more work. And it just basically word of mouth basically spread to the point where I was doing enough work where I started to think more seriously about doing audio engineering as a career. But one of the things that happened in the late 90s was I had a lot of customers who were getting to the point where they're actually thinking about putting out real releases rather than just demos more often than demos. And so the issue of mastering came up. Because I knew that it was an important step in the process, and I definitely wanted the clients who were serious about releasing quality records to go through that process. And so I started recommending them to various mastering engineers. Unfortunately, a lot of them came back to me weeks later to tell me that they had skipped the process because it was too expensive or that they had had a negative experience when they did actually go through the process. And so in a few cases, I started telling them that, at the very least, let me do just a once over at the record to make sure the levels are consistent, the output level is reasonable, any problems that they had or I had with the mix could be addressed either via mastering or through a remix, and just sort of trying to get the record sounding mastered, even though I knew at the time I definitely was not a mastering engineer and did not have the proper equipment at the time or even the best room for it. But I went ahead and did it on a couple of records, and one or two of them actually ended up on being released by fairly well-known labels, one of them being secretly Canadian and in Bloomington, Indiana. And when those records were released, people started seeing my name as a mastering credit, and I started getting more calls to do mastering work. And so I kind of panicked because I was not really ready, I didn't think, to do that kind of work, but people were asking me to do it. And so I would always add this caveat of, I don't really have quote-unquote true mastering gear, and I'm just getting started. But people gave me a shot, and I was really surprised at the positive feedback right away on my work in that realm. And at first, I kind of hated it because I just felt like I shouldn't be doing it. But I started to read up on it, learn a little bit more about it, and just getting my hands dirty doing it. I found that I actually really enjoyed it a great deal, and that's when I started to think that maybe I would actually enjoy doing it more than tracking and mixing. And very quickly, that became the case.
Well, why don't you define exactly what mastering is for us, and maybe where it came from and why it's there?
Sure. Well, I mean, the historical perspective is important, I think, and I didn't live it, but I can tell a little bit about it, I hope, with reasonable accuracy. Basically, what mastering is the preparation of a piece of media that is ready for mass production. And so when you have recordings that are in various formats, be it analog tape or digital files or audio CDs, DAT tapes, whatnot, it all eventually needs to be put into the format that it will be replicated in. Now, in the very, very early days, back in the 40s and whatnot, most actually recording studios simply captured live performances in a room through a small console and then cut straight to lacquer that performance. And so what left the studio was the thing that went off to be pressed. There weren't these multiple steps in the process. But as people started mixing down to various formats, such as analog tape being one of the very first formats that people started capturing stereo mixdowns to, there was necessary to be a process to get it from that format to the destination format. And in the vinyl days, that was a lacquer. Well, if you're in a studio mixing down to tape, somebody's got to then take those master tapes and create a lacquer so that it can be pressed to a vinyl LP. And that's what the mastering engineer did. They managed that process of getting it from the tape to the lacquer. And in the 50s and 60s, mostly those people were in charge of basically a flat transfer process. Basically, most engineers would say, these are the tapes, they shouldn't be touched. This is exactly the way we want the record to sound. And it was the job of the mastering engineer to then cut a lacquer that most closely approximated the tone of the original master tapes. What started to happen in the early 70s especially was that certain engineers, one of them being Bernie Grundman at Grundman Mastering in L.A. I think that's his current company. I think he was working for one of the major studios at the time. I don't remember which one. It might have been Universal. But he started to do more sort of esoteric treatments to the mixes when he was cutting lacquers. And things like EQ, equalization, to make things a little more exciting or interesting. Certainly correcting any problems. That's always been part of the process, is correcting problems. But there was also this additional step of making things, quote unquote, sweeter or more interesting, more exciting. And of course, louder. Everyone wants their record to be loud. That's true today.
Yes,
probably
it is.
too true today. It's always been true to an extent, though. The guys who could cut very hot lacquers for vinyl LPs were known for that, even back in the 60s and 70s. So it's always been an issue. But some of these engineers in the early 70s, these mastering engineers, started doing more sort of sweetening and coloring kinds of processes. And that started to change the game from a flat transfer process to this sort of, mastering makes the record more of a exciting product kind of process than just a mere process of getting it from analog tape to a lacquer. And in the digital age, one of the interesting things that has happened in the digital age is anybody at home with a studio can make a CD and send that off to the pressing plant. So in some ways, it's gone back to the way it was in the very early days of recording, when in the studio you could make the thing that went off to be mass produced. You can do that today. Anybody could send a CD they make off to the pressing plant. But the reality is very few people leave the studio with a digital pre-master, or an analog pre-master for that matter, that they feel is 100% ready to go to be a product in the marketplace. Most people feel that the tracks need to be made more consistent, maybe louder, almost always louder if it's rock music these days. Certainly more consistent, exciting. There's usually one or two problems that people had with mixes that it was too late to fix in the mixing process, and they want to see if maybe somebody can do something to fix those problems. There's usually a laundry list of things that people want to change after the product has already been mixed. And that's when the mastering engineer comes in. So a mastering engineer can do things to basically make what is the quote unquote final mix truly ready to be released. And sometimes projects do come in that are essentially, for all intents and purposes, flat transfers. Even today, I get things where people are like, this is perfect, don't mess with it. That does happen. But more often, people have a list of things that they wish were true of the recording that aren't, and that's where the mastering engineer is asked to do a little work.
Let's tackle a couple of those, because you used some words like louder, more consistent, exciting, sweetening, and things like that that could be up for interpretation by whatever the artist thinks those are.
Absolutely.
First of all, let's start with fixes. I'm kind of curious as to what you mean by something that could be fixed in mastering that you recognize in your mix that's an error and you want it fixed.
Oh, sure. Just a short list right off the top of my head. Especially in the digital age, people sometimes realize when it's too late that there are tiny little clicks or glitches in their mixes that they didn't notice when they were in the studio that they want to have removed. Sometimes there's tape hiss that's a little bit extreme that they wish was attenuated a little bit. Sometimes people find that when they put the mixes in their stereo, that certain frequencies are overwhelming and they didn't really notice that in the studio. So say in the studio it sounds great, but then they get it home and they play it in their home stereo where they know how their favorite records sound. And then it just sounds like there's just way too much high end or way too much low end. Those are sort of some of the things. Those are very common things that people point out to me. Another is on a much more basic level, and sometimes this is done intentionally, there won't be any fade outs applied to the tracks, and it's expected that is something that the mastering engineer will have to do. And so sometimes fades or crossfades come into play.
With those digital clicks, which I've experienced myself, you never noticed it. You've heard the song 100 times, 1,000 times, and then you finish up and there it is.
Yeah.
Are you like taking a sample of a different section of the song? Are you EQing it out, or how do you eliminate that in the mastering process?
There are probably a half dozen different ways to approach it, and it kind of depends on the nature of the error. One thing you can do if you have a DAW that allows this, and my workstation allows this. I said DAW, and for your users who don't know what that is, it's a digital audio workstation. I use a program called Nuendo. It's just one of many that people use for mastering. It's actually one that isn't used for mastering very often, but I like it a lot for the task. One thing it allows you to do is actually draw corrections to the actual waveform. And so if you see a little click and it's just that a couple of bits in the file are jumping several dB very suddenly, and that's what's producing the audible click, you can go in and actually just draw those out. And sometimes that takes care of it right away. There are declicker plugins that work pretty well sometimes. There's always the possibility of just snipping it out, making the file into two sections, snipping out the bad section and rejoining them and hoping that it's a small enough of an error that you won't notice the jump. And then if it's really serious error, you could, in fact, copy and paste sections one from another. That's pretty rare. That's pretty much only in cases where it's something really serious that it can't be fixed easily with one of the other methods.
Well, cool. Well, let's tackle the idea of making it louder. I hear that all the time. People talking about music in the digital age, how it's louder and beyond what they could have done back in the analog days. What exactly is that mean? I mean, what's being done to the mixes to make them louder?
Well, as I said, I mean, there's a history of this. And lacquer cutters in the 60s and 70s were known, some of them were known as the guys who could get really hot cuts. So the loudness issue isn't something new. But what happened that made it kind of go off the deep end is the invention of a device called the digital peak limiter, or the liquid head peak limiter, brick wall limiter. There's a lot of different names for it. But basically, it's a digital device. It's either a hardware device or a plugin. But basically what it does is a kind of compression called peak limiting. There's just a very, very fast attack, fast release type of compression that is if used in moderation, pretty hard to detect, although if you really push it, it's really pretty audible. Although we've gotten very used to it because it's applied to almost every rock release that's out there today. There are very few rock records made today that don't receive some amount of digital peak limiting. And so what happened once those devices were invented was there was no longer any trick to making something louder. It was literally a knob you could turn up. And how much you turned it up was really dependent on your tolerance for the artifacts that were being produced. And the artifacts are distortion in the low end, sometimes really nasty artifacts in the high-end treble range, especially in the cymbals, and just an overall change to the instrument balance in the mix, just as you'll have with any kind of extreme compression. So when used, with taste, digital peak limiting is a handy thing. It allows you to basically set a reasonably hot level without worrying about whether or not you're clipping the mix, because they don't clip generally. Generally, they are set so that the output ceiling is short of digital zero, so you don't hear clipping. But if pushed too hard, they tend to get a little bit extreme. But people started pushing them really hard in the 90s because suddenly you could make your record louder than anybody else's. And each year, band X would say, I want my record to be a little bit hotter than band Y's. And then the next year, band Y would say, okay, we want ours a little hotter than band X's. And then every year, records started getting a little louder, a little louder, a little louder, because no one wanted to be the quietest record on the multi-disc changer. And now nobody wants to be the quietest record on the iPod.
Yeah.
And it's a vicious cycle because the only limit, again, to how loud you make a record is your tolerance for these distortions. And people are getting very tolerant of the distortions. So unfortunately, people are making records really loud, way louder than they should, when they would almost always sound better if they weren't quite so loud.
That's mainly happening in the rock world. Or do you see that happening in like jazz?
I've heard examples in other genres, which is really silly, especially if they're not quote unquote loud music genres. But yeah, primarily it's the louder bands that want to have loud records. And that's always been true, But
will that also lessen the dynamic range? Say you were listening to a record that's like a jazz record where, there's a lot of nuances and areas where there is intentionally quieter instruments. Will that squish that dynamic range as well, making your record that loud?
Absolutely. That's what digital peak limiting is. It's a reduction in dynamic range. And that allows you to make the record louder. You reduce the dynamic range, and for each dB you reduce the dynamic range with a peak limiter, you can make it that number of dB louder, or in apparent loudness. But yes, you're absolutely right. One of the things that happens is the dynamics start to sound unnatural. And again, it's kind of sad. I think we have a whole generation of people who aren't really hearing it that way. But if you play a record that has been, especially the example you bring up is a good one, a jazz record that has been over limited. I think any jazz fan who's grown up listening to LPs from the 50s, 60s, and 70s would listen to that and be like, this should sound like a performance, and it no longer does.
Yeah.
It sounds like something happened to it. Ideally, I don't think mastering should introduce processes that make it sound like something happened to it. I think every listener dreams. I know a lot of audiophile listeners who their dream is they want to get as close to what happened in the studio as possible. And the more processes you heap upon the recording, the more steps you put between the studio and the final product, the further and further away you're getting from that performance. And really heavy-handed digital limiting is a very obvious, noticeable, artifact-ridden process that is really unfortunate, especially in genres where it's totally inappropriate. I mean, nobody expects a jazz record to be really loud, so why make it that way?